I'm Jackie O'Dowd, and you're listening to Connecting the Dots, a podcast series by Realising Potential. In this episode today, I've got the great pleasure of talking with Jo Fortin, who is an Acceleration Manager at Woodside. And we're going to explain what an Acceleration Manager does shortly. I first met Jo when she kindly agreed to do a talk at the Perth Digital MeetingUp, and I was absolutely fascinated by the things that she talked about. And at the end of the session, we couldn't get people to go home because they just wanted to keep on asking questions. So I thought this would be a really great opportunity to have a conversation and spread the message of how organizations need to think about large-scale optimization, transition, and transformation, because we're doing all three in most organizations all of the time. So, Jo, welcome to the episode today, and thanks for agreeing to do it.
Thank you so much for having me. When I met you at that talk, talking in front of a large crowd is always something that is a bit uncomfortable, but it was an amazing conversation, and it felt like a conversation. And when you reached out to have a follow-up talk, I was really excited because these are the things I'm really passionate about. Because transformation, and we're going to talk about mindset and culture, it's really rooted in understanding the culture and the mindset of a company to accelerate the delivery of outcomes. So I'm very excited to be here and have a conversation with you, and I can talk about what I've learned through the 8 years I've been spending working in transformation for utility company and resource company. I also started my career working in Silicon Valley. So I've been, working with innovation, technology, and kind of transformation for quite a while. And I'll talk about some of the things that I've learned through my journey to date.
Fantastic. Well, let's get started and explain to us, what does an acceleration manager do?
An accelerator manager does, what we do is that we're here to really help the organization accelerate the delivery of outcome. And what we're looking at doing is really value-based delivery. So my job is to come alongside the business, our business stakeholders, really define the problem spaces that they really truly care about, and then organizing an ecosystem for delivery. And the way that we do that is we're using enterprise design thinking, we're using agile ways of working, we're using those new ways of working, because now there's a recognition that the complexity of the problems have increased. We all work in a VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity. So all those things are really confronting organization to rethink that the delivery model they had in the past, especially around technology and digital solution, is not necessarily fit for purpose anymore. So my job is to organize an ecosystem of delivery that will allow them to start breaking down those really complex problems, organize themselves around these problems, and then start to tackle them in a way that will allow them to also pivot or adapt if they actually indeed realize that an area that seemed very complex might not be complex. So there's not the value we expected in this area. So for me, it's really about creating the right environment for organization to really solve for those complex problems.
So when you go into an organization, when you're working with an organization, and change is constant, right? It's like taxes, and it just goes on and on and on. But when you work with a larger organization, and there is so much activity, and there is a sort of resistance to change in certain pockets, not all, in certain pockets. then there's a certain culture and mindset that is a sweet point for doing that transition and transformation. What sort of signs do you look for in looking for, does the organization have the wherewithal in the mindset and the culture to get the results that they're looking to get?
So in my view, like, transformation never happens in a vacuum. You know, when I hear companies say we're going through a digital transformation, an agile transformation, my first question is why? Why are you seeking to transform yourself? Because no one will transform itself just for fun. This is hard, right? This is extremely difficult. It takes grit. It takes resilience. When you embark on something like that, these are not quick fixes and quick wins. So my first question always is why? Why do you want to do this? And in my view is it has to be driven from the top, right? The leadership has a really key role to play in really setting the narrative for the change, right? And they cast a very long shadow. So when I enter an organization and they have a project or program of work, I always seek to understand who's actually sponsoring that program of work and that project. And then I start to really listen. What kind of language are they actually using when they're talking about the project and the program? What are the teams around them actually saying? What are the teams, the people that report to them, or the teams that they've established? Actually, what is the language they're actually using about the projects and the program? When I hear things like outputs and milestones and there's nothing wrong with that language, but that really allows me to understand where they at in the journey of transformation, right? Because for me, I've been using agile ways of working for quite a while. And oftentimes when I enter an organization and they have those very big goals for transforming, the ways of working is also a means to an end. So they want to transform for a reason, right? So they see something coming their way and they realize that the way they've always done it will not allow them to go to where they need to be. So that conversation around the why, then oftentimes what we realize is they need to start to adapt to a new way of working, which then goes back to the mindset that they have around the way they've done it currently and to date. So oftentimes if I hear that language, I go, okay, I need to enable the change even more. So they will need to work with the executive team, with the sponsor, then with the team to build that golden thread around what good looks like.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does good look like for you, sponsor? What does good look like for you, team? Let's connect the dots and let's create the right environment that will allow us to reach that end stage. And the environment is really critical. So going back to culture is about understanding how we do things around here. So if we start aligning to the outcome, then we start to actually see what is it that we need to change to enable us to reach these outcomes.
Yeah. And a lot of it is about looking at how we need to behave in this new way, in this current state.
It's all
and
about
this
that.
future state. It's all about behavior. It's all about how we do things, when we do things. And it's amazing how many times you can go into an organization and they say, we want to do this transformation or this transition. But like you said, the conversations that happen on a day-to-day basis are not aligned to that.
No.
To that move or to that change. And there are different narratives held by different teams, and they're slightly different. So they have different favors. And that can be part support for the project and it can be part resistance for the project. So I think it's one of the key things that you have to assess very quickly.
Absolutely.
Do we have the wherewithal to actually make the change?
And I think this is why, when we talk about principles around ways of working, a lot of organizations have values. They plaster the values on the walls, and it's in the bathroom and it's everywhere. but the question that we always ask the team, and oftentimes when I start a program of work, I will get the leadership team together with the project team, and then we'll have conversation around social contract and behaviors, because the values are one thing, but okay, give me an example of what does this value mean for you? Like, what is your expectation around the behaviors around the value, right? Yeah. Because that can really change the tone of your team, of your program, of your project. If someone thinks, oh, integrity means this for me, and this is the behavior I'm expecting, versus someone else, and the behaviors, so what they see is not what they expect. And then there's confusion, and then there's misalignment around the ways of working. So oftentimes we spend quite a bit of time really understanding the soft elements of the delivery, because I think that it's soft, but it's the hardest thing.
It is the hardest thing.
It is the hardest, and it's the most important.
It is. There are two things that I think are absolutely mandatory on either a small project or a large one, and that is trust in the way of behavior, and the other is accountability. Because if we haven't got trust, and we can't trust the people that we're working with to do what they say they will basically do and be accountable for it, then we've got a problem.
Correct.
It's the first problem we're going to hit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, understand that at different level, again, of what trust and accountability means at that exec level, that, manager level, that team level is really critical. And then understanding how is then reflected in, the communication that those people are having, and how it manifests in the behaviors day to day, and therefore the outcome. Because again, outcomes are a result of those ways of working, and potentially the misalignment and the lack of trust, So when I hear, and, for us, because we work in that highly complex environment and problem, oftentimes things come to us because people have attempted to solve it 7 times for 5 years, and they've had multiple go at it. And then it comes, and then they say to us, quick. We've been trying to solve that for 5 years. So, I want it in 6 months. And then we spend time, oftentimes, it's about managing expectations, and it's about kind of rewiring the behavior and the expectations that people have around, okay, well, tell us more. What do you care about this problem? Tell us more. What is your expectations? And then it's about building very strong teams that are completely empowered to solve with these problems. And it's very hard. It's very hard because when you speak about accountability here, the accountability shift to the team to solve for those problems. But it can be very uncomfortable, when people are used to driving it a certain outcome by themselves.
Yeah. And I always find that sometimes organizational structures get in the way of people and teams working in that empowered way, because they will have a formal hierarchy and position and role within the organization. Absolutely. And then they have their team role. And unless that mindset and culture is that we empower the teams, and the management layer understands the impact of their people working in teams, which are typically now all cross-functional, then that is just such a way to break values, trust, and accountability across the project. You can't deliver.
No. And that's why I always oftentimes say to organization, start somewhere, build that muscle, with something that you really truly care about, get a good sponsor, get a team in, and, build those data points around why this works, because it does. Right. And I don't care the industry that you're in. A lot of people say, oh, well, that only works if you're a digital native company. I'm sorry, but no, it works everywhere. I've seen this work everywhere because, and that's something that I mentioned when I did that talk. I really believe that the transformation, it's like, baking a cake. There's key ingredients that you need to actually make the cake rise. Yeah. Then the flavor that you put on the cake can be very much dependent on your context, because I believe organizational context is really key. Industry context is key, right? Yeah. So that will change the flavor of the cake. But, the principles and the ways of working and things like you mentioned, like trust and team empowerment, it's a key ingredient.
Yeah. And absolutely.
There's no two ways about it, right? And there's a lot of, there's a lot of research that shows that. Again, for people that really care about the data, there's whole companies that have made a business out of having, an engaged workforce, because they know that engaged equals high performance. High performance equals better outcome. Yeah. Well, it's the same, right? When you organize teams and you empower them to work a certain way, it actually works. No doubt.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the importance of good sponsors. What do you look for in a good sponsor?
I really want someone that has skin in the game. I really, really want to understand again the reason for the change, because this is hard, like I said before. So, every time I've worked with organizations, stepped into a transformation role, I had very open conversations, really understand why, what kind of buy-in do we have? And I'm not looking for a perfect environment, because there's no such thing. Half the fun is also going in, and I'm a problem solver. I'm a problem lover, I should say, and I'm an outcome lover as well. So I'm not looking to say for solution. I love to get my hands and my arms around a really chunky problem, but I want to make sure that I'm also aligned to a sponsor that wants to come along on the journey and, can be coached on, again, new ways of working, that is aligned, that someone that doesn't mind being challenged, someone that doesn't do it because it's the flavor of the month, but do it because they have a chunky problem they need to solve. And that they are, determined to solve for this problem, but not set on a specific way to solve for the problem, because then that allows me to go in and inform, the organization as to the how. If sponsors are too attached to the how, I'm finding that oftentimes it's because they have a solution, an outcome in mind, or an output in mind, and then that is harder to shift.
Yeah. One of the things that I always find is certain key sponsors have a propensity to say, but that system or that process works for them over there, and so therefore it will work for us. And so we're just going to do that. And that's not the case, because every organization's level of complexity is different. They're complicated in different ways. So you can't go and replicate what somebody else has done. They're completely different. It may even be in the same industry, but it's not the same. Capability is completely different.
So when I spoke about the idea of, again, baking a cake, right? I would say to organizations, beware of someone that will come in and say we can solve everything by doing it exactly the same way that we've done at this organization, because context is king and context is key. Yeah. So when I come, into an organization, I spend quite a bit of time trying to diagnose what's really happening here, asking a lot of questions, and then going, okay, are there actual ingredients in place? What am I missing? What is it that I need to work on? but I never come in, saying, hey, this is the chocolate cake and there you go. And let's put a nice candle and here we go, because it never is the case. Because every organization is different, because organizations are led by people and people are complex in nature, right? And they're driven by different needs, different desire. So understanding that is really critical. I think a lot of the transformation and optimization world is about understanding organizational context and people and navigating that in a way that allows you to always be aligned for outcome. Always.
I think you're right. I think there are two elements to it. One is the organizational development. What do we need to do to be better, faster, stronger, more secure, whatever that happens to be? And then there's the organizational behavior. What do we need to do to be the best possible organization and team that we can be, given what we have and what we know?
Yeah. And I think organizations that truly like invest in their people and leadership, and they're the one that will be ahead in my mind, right? And also the organizations that can actually see the capabilities that they need for the future and map those things out, and then understand the gaps and understand how they will, partner, build, buy, and all of that will make them successful.
Yeah. We talked about the engagement of people, and when we're going through a change, we don't always have to deal just internal people with our own internal narratives. We have to work with external people and organizations as well, which makes life just a little bit complicated because you've got no control over those. So we always think about, well, let's just put a stakeholder management plan in place and we'll just model it out. We know who we need to talk to, when, what, and so that just then gets compiled and it sits on a shelf and nothing really happens to it. I actually prefer the term of stakeholder engagement for lots of other reasons.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing that, especially in the more connected world that we're all in, then that stakeholder engagement is becoming more and more critical in some elements, because those stakeholders can actually also be collaborators on our change. They could have been through this change themselves, this type, so they can have valuable input. What's your take on stakeholder management, as in being quite prescriptive, or stakeholder engagement?
Engagement all the way. There's no other ways, especially when you are transforming, optimizing ways of working. You will, that engagement needs to be at the beginning of the journey when you build your narrative around the change. In my view, gone are the days where change management was done in the back end of something, right? As a way to push a solution to users. What I've seen done very successfully is, let's build it at the beginning. Let's engage widely at the beginning. Understand. I think mapping who your stakeholders are is critical, because that really allows you to understand the complexity of the ecosystem in which you will actually operate.
Yeah.
Then you understand the touch points around those stakeholders. What do they care about? Why do they care about these things? And then what you do is not a management plan, it's an engagement plan, right? It's actually understanding, when do you need to engage, for what purpose, being very clear. And I think this is where I've seen, again, an agile cadence or rhythm working really well, because when you're dealing to a lot of uncertainty and complexity, people want to understand what will be predictable, right? Because that comforts them, or that calms them down. When we work in an agile environment, is there a cadence to what we're doing? We have stand-up and planning and showcases and all these things. So these things are fixed fixed things that we know will come back time and time again. And they're a really good touch point to engage their stakeholders. So once they start to wrap their head around that, then they understand the way by which they can engage with the change. And then they start to understand that the change is actually not being done to them, but they actually have touch points by which they can engage with the change. And then we give them a voice, right? So if I'm dealing with executive team, I will have a forum with the executive team where they can voice concerns, and then we'll ask them to make decisions. And, it's built as a cadence. And then it's done with the teams that are working on implementing the solutions as well, where they actually involve SMEs at the beginning of the design phase, all the way through an MVP, a minimum viable product, to the scaling of the product. So I'll give you an example. We've done some complex system implementation using this approach, where we actually sliced it in not like this, but really sliced it like this and say, okay, how we'll do it end to end on, for example, one asset, and we'll test it out. But we'll have to have SME at the beginning of the change. So it's done right at the beginning. And by the way, we don't compromise. So if the business gone, or we don't have time for this, we cannot give you an SME, we don't have time, our response back is we'll stop. We'll stop because I know, and we know that straight away will compromise the outcome, because it needs to be done with the people that will be impacted by the change, and because they will be the user of the product. So they need to be there from the beginning, right? So as we go through the change, then we start and we build a solution, and then we have those close feedback loops, in 2-week sprint and iteration. We've had very successful deployment where within 2 days, the product was fully adopted.
Wow.
Right? Because, and the change management was not done by a change manager, right? It was actually done by the people that were part of that team, saw the solution progress, now is at site, using the product, telling their mates, this is great. Hey, look at what we built. Look at what we built, right? So it's actually, so the change is embedded at the beginning, and it's owned by the people that will ultimately benefit from the change.
Yeah. And I find that's the way to go.
There's no other ways.
No, if you can get people involved and do things with them, not to them, the outcome's completely different. Buy-in is achieved so much earlier. There's very little resistance along the way, because I live in a world of questions, like solving problems and answering questions. So if we can bring the right questions and get those answered, then everything just progresses,
It
and
flows naturally.
And I do like the agile way of working for that, because in short spans of time, you know what the deliverable is going to be, and you pretty much can test what questions need to be answered.
But the agile, and that's the thing that, Scrum and agile, especially agile is around a way of doing and thinking and a mindset. So I'm not saying turn your whole organization to delivering Scrum. Don't do that, please. Do not do that. But the principles around transparency, principle around, customer first, all these can be adapted to anything that an organization is doing. Have the conversation, engage on a regular basis, manage expectations, get the people that will be impacted by any change that you're making. By the way, it doesn't have to be a systems change. It could be an idea that you have. It could be that, you're looking at a different way to organize your team around your deliverable. Talk to your team about it. Say, hey, I'm not too sure this is the problem that I have, or what do we do about it? It doesn't have to be a system. It's just a mindset and a way of looking at solving for complex problem. And some of them might not even be complex. It's just problems that you have. A problem shared is a problem halved. And I think it's
Yeah.
true. The mistake that I see organizations doing oftentimes is they don't always understand when to engage, which point to engage. And I think some organizations over-engage. And that's going to sound a bit funny here, what I'm saying, because I'm kind of contradicting myself. But I think it's really understanding the point of engagement, and also really understanding how the narrative that you're building around this at an organizational level, right? You need some kind of really big picture in terms of where you're doing. Because if you start hitting everyone with different narrative and engaging them in different bits, it's change and information overload. And then people need to context switch to become very confused as to what you're asking of them. So I'm a big proponent in really driving this holistically and somewhat centrally to actually go, why are we doing all these things? What is the bigger picture here? How are we managing the dependencies across all these programs, all these changes? Like all of this, you need kind of a control tower so that you can reassure your people, hey, this is why all of this is happening. We're moving together. We're moving in the same direction. We're not pulling in a different direction.
Yeah. I quite often use just one visual and I call it a transformation map. And what it does is it just captures the activities that are happening in the organization in the way of projects and change. So if you can put them, it's a bit like a World War II battle board, you know, where you're moving all the pieces and you can actually see what's happening. So you can say, well, here's our strategic objective. So this is what we're aiming for. This is what we need to achieve. But here's all these activities and projects and initiatives that are underway. And then you can drill down into each of those. So you can look at the business case, you can look at the team, you can look at the processes that are involved. And it just gives people this big picture view that's non-frightening, non-threatening, because it actually just reflects what's happening in the organization today. I just think this one image can just bring so much to the table. And to your point, then you can start to see what project is going to impact another. What resource utilization do we need to change? What do we need to ramp up? What do we need to slow down? It can just give you this great, I'd say, insight in and a better understanding of what is happening with the projects at any one point in time.
And I think we need that.
Decision making so much easier.
It makes it so much easier because it gives you a blueprint for the change that you need to enact as a business. Yeah. What I've seen, and I've started my career working a lot in strategy, is the way by which we used to do, strategy and planning and budgeting and all of that very sequentially. And by the time we're all done, half the year's gone, and then we have 6 months to deliver something. Right? All of this has changed, and there's as you know, a big movement as well and around beyond budgeting and risk planning and these things, because we know that the complexity of the environment has changed, but that doesn't change the need to have a strategic view and a lens by which you're moving to, all the organizations moving towards that objective. Then the blueprint that you construct around the how, and that's why a lot of organizations are starting to look at outcome and key results, and they're breaking these down into lead indicators. Is you don't have massive lag KPIs, but what you're doing is that you break all of this down. I think the more you can visualize, the better, because again, I think that allows people to really understand where they sit and there's visual people. Transparency, make that very transparent, and it's really challenging for organizations. But my view is be transparent, because if you are transparent, you build a narrative for the why and the change, you make it visible, people will connect to it, people will refer to it. And and also don't be afraid to call it early. If things have shifted, it's okay. It's okay.
Life gets in the way.
We've been through COVID, no one expected that. We all had to adapt. Well, I think organizations are the same, right? There's There's things that will happen, context will shift. Embrace it. Don't fight it, but also plan around it, change it, adapt to it.
I've got one more question before we finish. In the world of complexity, right, different organizations have different levels, but it's where we can't really see what's going to happen. We can't predict things to any great degree. So we haven't got certainty, but we do want to increase confidence. What's your view on simplification to help address complexity?
I think it's
of simplifying systems or simplifying processes or
I think it goes back to really projecting ourselves to an end state that will give you the blueprint for what needs to be done. Because what is perceived as simple now might not be perceived as simple in 6 to 12 months, right? Yeah. So I think that my view is organization needs to do that by design. So I'm a big believer, for example, in the IT world and digital world, to really have a digital architecture that is very much fit for purpose, that can give you the blueprint for those decisions, right? And then on the back of that, simplify these things as much as you can, but understand the trade-offs, because there will always be trade-offs even when you simplify things, right? And then try and I find that sometimes organizations try to compromise too much instead of actually trying to understand and make decisions around the trade-offs. And I think as a result, you end up with a less than optimal solution because everyone's compromised too much, right? Yeah. So I think that it's so hard to simplify. It's so much more, it's easier to just pile it on, right? With system and solutions and processes. And I think that I'm a big proponent of trying to simplify. But if you want to simplify, first of all, understand the problem. And, I said that to you earlier. I fall in love with the problem. I often say that to the teams because it's, very tempting to go straight into solution. And I say, just fall in love with the problem. Spend some time really understanding the problem. And I think that's why enterprise design thinking also works really well, because it's about then understanding a systems thinking. I think a lot of organizations are moving towards systems thinking. And the reason they're doing that is because it's to simplify, right, as much as they can, the concept and abstract of the system, which is highly complex. And then once you understand that, then understand the underlying architecture and systems and processes that actually will allow you to reach that end state that you really want as a business. And then simplify that as much as you can. And understand the trade-off of simplification. Because it's not easy.
No, it's not. And as I mentioned to you, we use a 7-element schema, right? Strategy, structures, process, people, tech, information, and it's enveloped by a right-sized governance framework to make sure it all comes together. And for me, it's all about connecting those dots, because if we are going to have a fairly good stretch target in our strategy, then all of those other 6 elements need to move with it. They need to adjust with it. If we're going to change your technology layer, it's going to impact your process. It's going to impact the information and the data that you use.
Absolutely.
It's going to deliver or hinder your business model. So I like to look at that, putting those 7 elements in a 3D mix and move them around and say, if we're going to change one, what does it mean to the other? And I think if you can have those conversations when you first start, know where things are going to start, where they're going to finish, and what done and success looks like.
Absolutely.
Then
if it's worth doing,
if
if it's worth my view, if it's worth doing, it's worth measuring. I'm a big proponent of that. I'm also a big proponent of understand your value really well. And, people, think value equals dollars. Not necessarily. It really depends what is important to you as an organization. Align that value to your strategic imperative as a business. And then when you are looking at doing something, solving for a problem, understand how much value the solving of that problem could bring to your organization. Then break it down. Then understand which element are you going to go, you're going to seek to deliver first, and then measure. And when I hear people, I can't really measure that. Yeah, you can. I'm sure you can measure everything, right? Just make sure though that you're measuring the right thing. And the measure is not about, again, the measure is not about trying to give you a license to keep doing the things, right? It's not measuring to say we're good here, nothing to see, we're going to keep going. Measure as a way to potentially pivot and adapt, right? This is what I very much care about when I look at. So we have a plan on the page that we utilize to guide our delivery, and we break that into quarter where we have lead indicator success, and then we measure and we visit. And I say to the team, I don't want to see all green. Don't give me what I call the watermelon measure, right? When it's green outside and then you cut it and it's red inside. just just tell me it's okay. Like, are we tracking the way we should? Do we need to reassess? Do we need to pivot? Do we need to change? It's fine. Things change. It's not a problem. But I think use value as a guide, and as a guide, use a value as a guide, as a way to also guide your conversations around the table, the exec table, the project table. Align your view of value, because then you can also understand the trade-offs that you'll need to make, and prioritize accordingly.
I think
no one can do everything. It's impossible.
No, it's not. And it's all about priorities too. It's it's hitting the right things at the right time. I think you've given us today just an amazing insight into how people can connect their own dots, things to watch for, traps for unwary players, which has been fantastic. For those that are one last piece of advice, short and punchy, on how do you suggest people optimize the results that they can get? If there was one thing, what would it be?
To optimize the result that they get, it probably goes back to just what I just said.
Is it about just being clear about value?
I was reflecting on that, but value is such a loaded word.
It's ambiguous, right? Too, because it means
very
different
ambiguous
things. Yeah.
So I think for me the thing is, understand your drivers. I'm going to go with understand your drivers.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. Understand your sponsorship drivers. Understand your program drivers. Understand what's driving yourself as an individual. What's driving your team. What's driving an organization forward. Understand the drivers. And there's a lot of different layers to that comment. And so I had to think about it. But I think understand the drivers. And once you understand that, it's going to give you a really good blueprint for the how.
Yeah.
But spend time understanding, and don't do it once a year.
Make it a continuous thing.
Exactly. Just understand and seek to understand these drivers all the time. All the time.
Well, that's been absolutely fantastic. thank you so much. I know you're incredibly busy, so thanks so much for taking some time to enhance and further the discussion from the meetup group. It's been absolutely fantastic. Really
Thank you so much
valuable.
for having me. It was a very enjoyable conversation.
All right, no doubt we'll catch up soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.